Right, we seem to have stabilized on terms of numbers, so let's get cracking. Well, first of all, good afternoon, or whatever the appropriate salutation is, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you very much for coming along to this webinar on packaging policy. I think probably when most people think about sustainability in wine, they first think about, the bucolic view of a vineyard, with the sun lancing through the vines and, lots of birds and bees and stuff floating around, and that better vineyard practices meaning that you've got more of said birds and bees. But the reality is slightly more prosaic, that from a carbon perspective at least, the most important topic in wine sustainability is packaging. As we know from our own work on bottle weight, that anything up to half the total carbon footprint of wine is the packaging it comes in. Although that is changing, and part of the change is being brought about by changes in regulation. We know from our bottle weight accord that the introduction of extended producer responsibility, effectively levies on the amount of packaging that gets put into the public domain by retailers and others, has been a key driver for the bottle weight accord. Obviously, that is in place and in real in the UK, but will be coming into practice in the EU, in states of the US, and Australia, and other jurisdictions over the coming months and years. So very much this whole policy environment is pretty key to any discussion about packaging in wine. But the question obviously is where does all this go? I mean, in the UK, there are big questions about where next for EPR. I mean, obviously pressure both ways, environmentalists saying it should be maintained or the fees increased. Others in the business sector saying that actually it's a swinging charge on businesses that are already facing challenges. We're supposed to have a DRS, a deposit and return scheme, comes into practice next year, but not particularly clear exactly how that's going to work at the moment. In the EU, the packaging regulations there come into force on the glorious 12th of August. And again, there's going to be an EPR and a DRS component to all of that. And in this case, theoretically, it's much more stringent because it becomes required law in each of the member states rather than effectively advisory. But again, the details of exactly what that's going to look like remain sketchy. And in the US, I think it's 7 states. Laurel will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. 7 states are also mooting an EPR DRS process. But again, it'll be interesting to see how that develops over the coming period of time. And in Australia, there is an EPR structure in train, but that seems to have been stalled for the time being. So therefore, the situation is changing. Regulation is incredibly important, and that will provide challenges. That will require responses, but also it'll provide opportunities. We've seen it within our packaging work. The an increased focus, for example, on cans for wine packaging, and that's been at least partly driven by regulatory change. So what does all of that look? What does that end up looking like? We always say in SWR that our sort of superpower, our key strength is that we are able to bring the entire wine value chain together, because inevitably these decisions don't rest just with one part of the industry. These are things that we all have to think about and address. And again, that sort of cross supply chain thing is demonstrated today through the speakers that we're lucky enough to have with us today. And in no particular order, Simon Mason, who is a stalwart contributor to many of our webinars from the Wine Society. Each of them will say a little more about themselves when I pass over to them. And obviously, Wine Society is a retailer in the UK, wine specific. We have Laurel Parker from a US-based organization called Abridge, which provides subscribers to its platform with insights into the latest regulatory norms and compliance information on everything, international agreements, local regulations across more than 110 countries on wine, spirits, and other alcohol beverages. It's an incredibly comprehensive database of regulation. So we'll hear from her in a moment. And last but no means least, Marcel Arsand from Ball Corporation, which is a can and aluminium bottle manufacturer. And it's perhaps testament to how long I've been doing this sustainability gig that I wrote the first CSR report, as it then was, for a ball company precursor called Wrexham back in 2003. So I've been doing cans for a while. So in a second, I'm going to hand over to the speakers because you'll want to hear from them, not from me. But obviously, the way this panel is structured, you can just see us. rather than each other. But obviously, one of the speakers have had their say. We want as much participation and contribution from the audience. So from, i.e. from you. So there should be, each of you should see at the bottom of the screen a Q&A function. And so if you do have questions, points you want to make, please put comments in there. And I think, Ilva, you can then pass those on to me. Yes, because I don't have sight of that. So if you pass that on to me, then we can raise those in discussion. So I'm going to shut up at that point and hand over first to Laurel. And really, I've I've teed you up as being the font of all knowledge and where we are with regulation. So, Laurel, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And yes, as you mentioned, there's a lot going on in the EU and the UK right now. I would say about 10 years ago, anything to do with sustainability or packaging was something that was a nice to have for producers, distributors, manufacturers. It was something that was used for consumer interest. It was something that was part of a general industry moral compass on being better towards the environment. You fast forward to today, it is impossible to deal with any market from a regulatory compliance aspect without having sustainability and packaging requirements be part of how you are getting something from start to the finish with the consumer. And so while we could easily spend 3 to 4 hours just on this, I'm going to just highlight, I think, what is the most important regulation coming out of the EU and what you have to look forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years, as well as what Peter briefly touched on with what's going on with the UK and what can we also expect in the new years coming after that. So in the European Union, we do have a law that's called the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulations. I'm going to call that the PPWR moving forward. And this is an overarching framework that seeks to help all 27 member states harmonize packaging, recycling, EPR requirements across the board. And the goal here is to harmonize and be helpful. But as we'll see, sometimes there's a lot of chefs in the kitchen when there's 27 of them. The three big components you can expect to see topically when it comes to packaging from this regulation. The first is going to be addressing the ability for the finalized product to be recyclable. Does the wine can, the wine bottle, the bag in a box have a certain amount of recyclability for the consumer to do? There are going to be thresholds. As Peter mentioned, the law will go into effect in August of this year. There are a lot of sliding scale dates. You'll see target requirements, you'll see formal enforceabilities as far out as 2008, 2030, 2035, and even 2040. So what does that mean if you're a producer, a distributor, a manufacturer? That means there will be some things that have to go into effect starting in August. For example, with recyclability, there's a requirement that the container be at least 70% recyclable. There will be targets moving that forward to a higher percentage by certain targets you can find in the law. That applies differently into some aspects, whether it's glass, whether it's single-use plastics, whether it's aluminum, cork, cardboard, anything of that nature. The other of the three that's a big target is going to be what components of the product itself as is already recyclable. If we have a 750 milliliter glass bottle for wine, how much of that glass that comprises the product currently is made from recycled glass? Is the screw top made from recycled aluminum? Things like that, and there will be targets moving forward. The last major part of this is waste reduction or complete elimination. If you are dealing with glass bottles, Peter mentioned the SWR has a bottle weight accord. It's that mentality of the weight, the thickness, the size. Are we able to reduce the amount of packaging needed in order to get it to the consumer? That also includes transportation costs. If we're having single-use plastic peanuts, we're having wine bladders to transport, we're using cardboard to help maintain stability during transportation. All of that is going to come into effect into this law. Now, what does that mean for producers, for distributors, for manufacturers? Does it matter if there's a difference between the three? The short answer is yes, it does. That's going to come down to different requirements for obligations when it comes to deposit retain schemes. That's going to be different requirements for reporting and registrations. And that's also going to be different costs for the type of product to use, for the type of recycling deposit return scheme. And Simon in particular will get into this during his segment of how does that affect different costs throughout the supply chain with going there. That's going to be the most interesting thing. What will also present some issues, both with costs that are a little bit more understandable, and then I think also unexpected costs. You now have 27 different countries that all have to implement these requirements, but don't have to do it the same. Is Romania going to exempt glass from deposit returner schemes? Is Italy going to have a certain higher price? Will Croatia have certain registration requirements? And now you're, as a company, having to deal with a bunch of different factors from 27 different areas. That particular issue also applies in the UK. We tend to think of the UK in international trade terms as one unit, but in reality, you do have England, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. And currently, their big law that has recently been put into place is the producer responsibility obligation packaging waste regulations, which, while has some application to manufacturers or distributors, puts a large part of this responsibility on the producers. In particular, there's a reporting mechanism. Many acronyms abound, but it's the Recyclability Assessment Methodology, also known as RAM, which helps dictate how much you have to pay in costs. There's a flat out way to do plastic and aluminum. And then there's a simple glass tax on glass where there's just a basis rate. It makes it more expensive. And while the UK is one geographical unit, it is 4 different countries. Coming up, as Peter alluded to, will be the deposit return scheme or system in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and in England. Glass is going to be exempted from that. That's going to be something that a producer, as of this moment, can anticipate not to incur fees on. However, Wales has currently in draft legislation and in every indication moving forward has an intent to have glass be part of that and likely be one of the more expensive parts of the DRS scheme. And so that's where we really start with what's going to tee up why Simon's talking about cost, why Marcel's talking about the strategy around alternative materials. Is now we're dealing with requirements. It's no longer just a consumer strategy. It's no longer a marketing tactic. If you want to get your product into a market, into a retailer, into the hands of the consumers, we now have to deal with mandatory requirements, the same thing as you deal with labels and the same thing as you deal with ingredients.
Great, thanks, Laurel. That's it's fascinating in that I guess what many of us hope from a regulatory situation is that it provides predictability, that it provides a sort of something against which one can plan. But particularly from the way that you described the situation in the EU and even in the UK, it's almost going to be a kind of Tower of Babel. You could end up with, if you take the 4 countries of the UK plus the 27 members of the EU, you've got potentially even within the continent of Europe more than 30 potential sets of requirements that have to be met, which is obviously not ideal. But I do think a key point is this: it's now not about a kind of nice to do or our consumer preference is X or Y, or our consumers might like X or Y. It's no, actually, this is now hard law, so we need to go along with it. So from that kind of overview of the complexity of the kind of regulatory environment, now go to someone who's having to wrestle with this and has having to be wrestle with this from probably ever since I've known you, Simon, from the Wine Society, and what this implies for being able sensibly to forward plan and understand what structures you might need, what packaging you might want, and how you move forward from here.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And hello, everybody. Laurel, that was fantastic as an introduction to the subject. I'm going to play it back to my CEO, I think, so that he knows why he keeps me employed at the moment. But certainly, yeah, we are seeing a lot of those challenges coming through, and we're trying to pick our way through it all. For a bit of context for those that don't know of the Wine Society, we are a UK online retailer. We're a relatively small, large business, about 160 million pounds a year turnover. We are owned by our customers. Essentially, we're a cooperative, and we pride ourselves on working with a really interesting, exciting range of wine producers from around the world. We deal with about 800 different producers and turn over probably about 5,000 to 5,500 SKUs each year. So it's quite a diverse product base that we work with. A lot of those producers are very small family producers. A lot of them are spread out through all of those EU countries and further afield as well. And for some of them, we are the only people that they export to. So we're having to work with them to help them understand the requirements on the UK market as well. So I think what's quite interesting actually for us in particular is that whilst we are just a UK company and sell just in the UK, PPWR is already having an impact, and some of these other legislations globally are having an impact as well. So one of the key concerns for us is how aligned they all remain as they develop, just to make sure we're not kind of having to come up with one set of requirements for the UK, but our producers are having to deal with something quite different. And I'll come on to one example of that perhaps in a little bit. To give a kind of, again, a context to the size of the challenge we've got around extended producer responsibility in the UK. Previously, our packaging bill, 450, 500,000 pounds a year for PRNs. Once extended producer responsibility came in, that jumped overnight to 1.5 million. So immediately there was a considerable amount of pressure on the sustainability team, which is myself and one other colleague, to do what we can to reduce that as much as possible. And the key driver for that, for us as a wine company, is glass bottle weight. And so our big focus has been on reducing the weight of glass bottles. We estimate that since we started that program as signatory members of the SWR Bottle Weight Accord, we think we've probably saved something like £65,000 a year through lightweighting. And that's kind of building year on year as we progress with that. So that's going to continue to be a very, very important factor. Alongside that, we've worked on eliminating unnecessary packaging, which in wine is typically capsules, looking at what we can do around shipment secondary packaging as well, and ensuring that all of the materials used give us the best possible rating in the RAM that Laurel mentioned, so that we get the best possible rate under EPR. So eliminating materials, reducing the weight of glass bottles, and then the other area which I do quite a lot of work on is around what are lower carbon but also lower taxed formats as well. So for us, that is largely bag-in-box. So that I think is the most established format probably in the UK. It's normally something about, I think it's about 7% of UK sales volume goes through bag-in-box. For us, it's a little bit lower than that, but we're working up towards that figure. But we're seeing some really good uptake with that format, and it significantly cuts the EPR bill there for us. To give a kind of an equivalent, the EPR cost on 9 litres of wine, so a dozen bottles of wine, is about £1.44. For the same volume of bag-in-box, it's about 20 pence. So particularly where we're looking at less expensive wines, where we're trying to hit price points, where we're trying to offer the best value to our customers, to our members, bag-in-box suddenly becomes a much more compelling choice for those wines to help hit those price points. Alongside that, we offer cans, and we also offer recycled PET bottles, both of which at the moment don't fall under extended producer responsibility because of deposit return scheme coming up in a year or two's time. So there's, again, some quite good commercial reasons why we would want to expand the use of those particular formats as we progress. The complications that we are seeing is that we have the 2 deposit return schemes coming down the line, one potentially with glass, one without. That's then prompting us to ask questions around which formats we want to persevere with, because the setup costs for continuing with, say, cans and with PET for a small percentage of our sales volume will be quite high. So again, we're looking to assess that. And we're also seeing the impact of PPWR from the EU Because we import a lot of wines directly from very small producers, they're currently working out the best approach for their wines in their countries. Often that's actually reuse. So rather than lightweighting bottles, they're actually putting wine into bottles which can go through the local reuse system, which is perhaps not the lightest weight bottle that it could be. So there's already some challenges emerging there around the sort of continuation of our bottle weight reduction program. So I suppose in summary, it's a very complicated set of requirements at the moment. We're trying to keep things as aligned as possible. What that looks like for us is reducing the weight of materials, as that's the key driver of costs, looking at formats which offer us cost savings, but also which actually offer something to our customers. And fundamentally, that's best prices, and considering how the different formats fit into their purchasing patterns.
Thanks for that, Simon. As ever, fascinating. But a couple of points to draw out. I think, just that sheer shift in cost. I mean, for 9 bottles of wine, £1.44 in tax, and the equivalent wine and bag in box 22p. I mean, that's pretty compelling either for the retailer because that's a cost saving, or passing that on to the consumer. That historically bag in box in the UK has had a certain image challenge. But if you start to drive that through, then that sort of saving starts to make the consumer look at these things in a rather different light. But I think also a key point you make is effectively you didn't quite put it like this, but you don't want to pull smaller producers out of shape. It's all very well having all these different requirements, but there'll come a point in time at which, and fine, if you're a big producer, you can have the flexibility of 2 or 3 different lines to go to different markets. But if you're a small producer, then that's not an option. I mean, we were talking to a smaller producer the other day in Australia, and they were saying, well, obviously there's a lot of focus on bulk shipping, but we send about 2 pallets a year into the UK, so that's never going to be an option for us. So that's fascinating. So now I'm going to pass on to Marcel, who arguably might be seeing all of this looking rather rosy for a can maker. But again, be really interesting to focus on how does this affect you as a manufacturer? How are you dealing with this multitude of regulatory structures, DRS schemes, and so on? And how are you seeing this reflecting in how you work with the wine sector?
Thanks, Peter. So for folks that are not familiar, Ball Corporation is the world's biggest producer of aluminum cans. Roughly every 2 cans, 1 is ours. It's a 140 years old business. We started with glass, left that business. We went into PT, auto PT. We weren't even in aerospace for a long time. We are 100% on aluminum packaging at the moment. So we started with cans. We also do aerosol for deodorant and home care product, but we also do bottles. So of course, having those options for consumers and for customers I think this is the key. Laurel and Simon would really putting the cards on the table in terms of those decisions are being made at the moment, and the legislation is driving those decisions. And in the past was very much on carbon savings, Paris Agreement, 2030, 2040, decarbonization. That was the type of goal that everybody was aiming at. Now is like August 2026. We have the PPWR with a lot of the targets and new targets coming up every year after. So, of course, those decisions are starting to be way more on the long-term carbon reduction, more on the how it's hurting the pocket. And then you have, of course, countries making decision in terms of DRS, EPR, glass included, excluded. I'm based in UK. I was part of the whole debate on, should glass be included or not? And I was talking to the glass industry guys. You'll be better off in a DRS than in a EPR, because you're comparing the cost of a DRS in the future versus a current EPR, which is not going to exist because EPR is getting reformed. So it's going to be an expensive EPR. And, truth to the word, like, glass in a EPR in UK is probably the second biggest, the second more expensive in Europe at the moment, because it's looking to total cost of ownership. It's looking to the, the heaviness, the price of recycling of the material. If you have 1 ton of glass and you sell that for £20 a ton, and you have 1 ton of aluminum, you can sell that for 1,200, 1,500 pounds a ton. That makes a difference in the collection system. That makes a difference into the producer fees and how much that is going to get reflected. So for example, you take any DRS in Europe, well-designed DRS, so the Nordics, other schemes that are coming up, like, producer fees for aluminum packaging is usually zero, because the intrinsic value of that packaging is being transferred into the scheme. You're adding value, you're adding a commodity into the scheme. And usually, which happens a lot in current EPRs, but this is what we hope is not going to happen anymore. And the Circular Economy Act is looking to reform EPRs in that level as well, is the cross subsidies. So we tend to have a lot of eco-modulation. Well-designed packaging pays less than badly designed packaging, but there's a lot of subsidies, cross subsidies going on in current EPRs, and lack of transparency how those costs happens. In the future EPRs, there's a lot of more governance and transparency happening in terms of how those costs are calculated. And ideally, no cross subsidy should happen. So glass should pay for glass costs, PET, plastic for plastic costs, aluminum for aluminum costs. And those costs will get reflected when those decisions are starting to be, so it's going to be accumulation of, policies and costs of compliance that is going to be reflecting on the decision making on that. So of course for us, we've been talking a lot of in terms of cans as a substitute, and we can do can size that can replace. And for example, if you think about, and Peter, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think your commitment is to go around 420, below 420 grams. If you take a 420 grams glass bottle and replace that on a per liter with cans, you have a 75% carbon reduction by doing that. That's a huge number. And if you think, okay, but what if my customers want to have a resealable bottle that looks exactly like a wine bottle, but looks on the shelf? So we can do a aluminum bottle, 750 ml, and a carbon reduction be around the 12%. So there's more aluminum, of course, the carbon going to be a little bit higher, but so those decisions are happening right now, and customers being able to understand that options available on the market can help you to get there. I think this is the level of conversation we're having a lot right now. UK for sure, EPR is already here. In other European countries, that EPR cost is still to be decided, and how PPWR is going to play. But the importance is these opportunities are available for those customers that want to make those decisions, and how much that beyond the cost, beyond the and beyond now, how much it's going to cost in 2030, for example, when all those legislations are going to start to be eminent.
Thanks, Marcel. Again, fascinating. And again, I think it focuses the mind very clearly on the significant carbon savings from things that aren't glass. But you raise a point, and I think this is often one that people come back to, is about that consumer perception piece. Simon, I'm going to come to you first on this, obviously. That whether we like it or not, the glass bottle remains the predominant format, and it's the one, therefore, that people are the most familiar with. I mean, not that there's much in the way of consistent market research information about consumer perception on wines, because no one's done it recently. But certainly the work we've done suggests that there are potential challenges with other formats. So, I mean, Simon, I know you've done a lot of work on how putting wines in different packaging, how that goes down with consumers. And except you're already talking here about the UK market, but I suspect there will be parallels elsewhere. So be interesting in starting off with Simon, then coming to Marcel and Laurel, a view of the consumer perception of some of these things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's very nuanced. I mean, what our objective are lower carbon formats has been to basically ensure that quality of the wine going into that packaging stands up to member expectations. I think the days of we need to change the perception, essentially, I guess, that bag in box, for example, is only lower quality wines. And so as part of our bag-in-box range, we've listed wines from Tablas Creek, which retail at sort of £69 for a bag-in-box, just to show that actually there's nothing inherently sort of wrong with the format, and that it works extremely well for certain styles of wine at all price points. And I think certainly for bag-in-box, that's worked well. We've seen good sales growth. We've seen very positive comments on the quality of the wine in those formats. All of our kind of technical measurements have come back very, very well. So that's looking very good. But I think there was a bit more of a history with that particular format in the UK, certainly. So I think people have already sort of understand it a bit better. I think the challenge we have sometimes is with different formats and different sizes of formats is that consumers perhaps don't quite know what to do with them yet, don't quite understand how they're supposed to kind of interact with them. I think that's one advantage that we have got with the recycled PET bottle that we use, which is a 75 cl, albeit in a different shape. And I expect it would be the same actually with the aluminium bottles as well in that shape. I think that would go down very, very well with customers. But really the challenge is to get these products in front of them, get people tasting the wines, and as soon as they realise that actually the quality is exactly the same as it would be in a glass bottle, albeit potentially with a sort of different consumption window, that people are generally quite receptive to trying them. I think some of the challenges arise in getting people to make that switch in the first place. People are so used to having glass that they need a very compelling reason to change. And actually, I think this is where EPR might come in, because we can now, if we choose to, offer to pass those savings directly on to consumers for the lower carbon formats. So it could be that we offer a glass bottle of a wine at £9.95, but we offer this exactly the same wine in a lower carbon and also cheaper EPR format for, I don't know, 50p a pound less, still make our same margin and give people actually a compelling reason to change, rather than just appeal to the sort of the goodness of their hearts and the sort of the perhaps slightly naive expectation that they all care about the environment as much as we do. So I think it's actually making these kind of compelling reasons to change now is the way forward. Yeah, I say we're very happy with the quality in all of the formats that we've tried, and certainly the feedback from members has been extremely positive on all of them once we've got them in front of them.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's given that we know that, as you say, that it's easy and completely realistic to be quite cynical about consumers' ability to deliver on claims of sustainability versus what they might say. But we know
this is always a thing. I mean, I think that the bag-in-box is a great sustainable format, but also it's great for picnics and it's great for parties and it's great to have your house wine, a box of red and a box of white in the utility room and dip in as you want. So I think we sell an awful lot more bags in box for those secondary reasons than we do for the fact it's potentially got a lower carbon footprint. Compelling reasons, I think, that will appeal to people, and appealing to people's wallets at the moment, I think, is a particularly compelling reason.
Yeah, well, and also we know that when it comes to anything, price is the first driver in anything in terms of consumer goods. Marcel, I'm going to come to you next on kind of on the similar point. I mean, you said during your remarks that the regulatory changes are tending to have make manufacturers come to you and say, right, well, all the reasons that Simon's saying we're more interested in aluminium cans. What are the sort of kind of questions they raise about how that might be perceived by consumers? What responses are you able to give? I guess also shifting sideways slightly is, what maybe lessons are there that wine can learn from other beverage alcohol, which has, had cans in use for very much longer?
Yeah, good one. A lot of conversation we're having at the moment with customers that are switching completely from, like, say, never use aluminum in the past, to just make sure that how is the acceptance from a mechanical point of view, in terms of you have deposit return system happening, you have reverse vending machines as the normal compaction mechanism through those systems. So ensuring that the packaging can going through. And this is something that, we already have these bottles in existing deposit return system. So there's not going to be you're not shifting to something that, you're going to have like some impediment from continuing using that. So reassuring that this is happening. From the consumer point, is usually more from our customers that look into that. But I think is a valid point, even to Simon's, like if I know I will choose a can if I go to a picnic rather than taking like a massive box, but because that's the way my household is, not everybody is a wine drinker, but having that kind of easy dose is single portion, keeping the packaging fresh is also something that is also giving that opportunity for other formats to have a presence in the selection process. So again, I'm conscious of being very biased from aluminum because I'm talking from where I stand. But for example, you giving the packaging 100% light blockage, is an opaque packaging, so you're not going to have light as a potential deterrent to the taste, to the quality of the product. You can have resealability on that. If you look into the bottle size, you can have, if you want something, you want to drink a chill or a white wine, chills really fast. And in terms of if you are in the system, for transportation, lightweighting, all those attributes are quite favorable. Stackability, transportation. So it's a really it gives all those sustainability credentials to that. So when it comes to decision, of course, like cost is part of the conversation, but it's more like understanding how the packaging will benefit those decision making, and of course in terms of adapting, of course, from a bottle line into a canning line, you need to make some modifications, straightforward, but moving from bottle to bottle is much more straight than doing bottle to can, for example. So much more easy to adapt. So yeah, opportunities are growing massively, and quality wise, we tend to say like we do the most simplistic drink in cans and bottle at the moment, which is water. And again, it came as a way to provoke the system. We were very much on a PT market for water, and people just simply accept that for a long time until we start to decide that actually there's some consequence to that. But if you can do water in can and it doesn't have a taste or a flavor, doesn't impact on the taste, anything is possible pretty much. Because that's the product that you're gonna easily distinguish of anything that it's not supposed to be there. So opportunities are huge for that. Not just on the consumer point of view in terms of being able to choose, but also from how much that is gonna interfere in those decisions in terms of policy compliance.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll come to in a sec because they're both very interesting and important ones. Just wanted to quickly come to you, Laurel, to kind of loop back into what you were saying about the regulatory changes, and effectively, it's to paraphrase, to make it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. Then if you add into that, as you say, the situation in 7 different US states plus the rest of the US, are you getting any sense of there being any degree of join up, any degree of sense of how complicated from the regulators themselves as to how complicated this makes things? Be just interested in your view of how you think, at the moment it seems that we're almost moving towards, as I said before, a kind of regulatory Tower of Babel when it comes to packaging for wine. What view have you got on whether or not that might move into something more sensible down the line?
Yeah, I think right now the best playbook we have is to look to see how governments have really handled the regulation of the just complete explosion of the innovative products with wine-based ready-to-drinks, aromatized, mixed cocktails, what we at Abridge call other alcohol beverages. That has also, like a lot of this packaging, a phrase I use too much, has become the wild, wild west. And you'll see a lot of countries not sure how to regulate things that don't have proper definitions, or as Marcel is saying, is going to be changed and revoked and repealed and rewritten. And so the honest answer is, from seeing how this other than wine product category has been handled from a regulatory standpoint. It's going to be slow coming, and I do think it's going to change as it goes. I think, unfortunately, the answer is going to be trial and error. I think, as you can see with the PPWR, there is an honest attempt to have harmonization to make it somewhat helpful for producers, distributors, and manufacturers to at least have something. But the US is a great example. There is no national level EPR. That is going to be 50 individual countries at that point from an export perspective regulating this. And so if what we've seen with the product innovation when it comes to the ingredients and the actual product itself with, mimosa in a can type things, then the product and innovation that's going to be coming with packaging, whether it's transitioning to bag in a box to aluminum, or for those companies that still feel a huge marketing tie to presenting in glass, how do you still have those, innovative reductions in the cost, the weight, the size of the glass? I do think we're going to see states, countries attempt to make it easier. And then I think as we as a global industry start learning what works, what is probably prohibitively expensive, what is manageable, you'll start to see a lot of shifts. I would not be surprised if laws like the producer responsibility obligations in the UK and the PPWR in the EU have multiple amendments over the years to attempt to address that. Same in the States. I think the reason why you're seeing only 7 instead of 50 states with EPR or 10 states with some kind of deposit returner scheme is that I think the domino effect that has stereotypically gone with things like ingredient labeling or sulfites that must be put on a label is not going to happen here. You're going to have a lot of areas wait and see, and there's the proverbial guinea pigs that are happening right now. So it's not the answer I think you want, but it's going to be trial and error.
It's perhaps not the answer I wanted, but it's perhaps the answer I expected. There's rather too much of government policies, trial and error. And I think already, I mean, if you can take the UK as an example, I do think that there's certainly been some, quite how active, but I think there has certainly been some realization that the current EPR may need to be massaged. And I come to one of the questions in the Q&A, which is really rather interesting. Quite rightly says that so far our focus has been only on carbon, and obviously certainly from a sustainability perspective, one of the things we try and do is get away from that constant carbon tunnel. I mean, obviously to some extent because that's been the focus through reporting over the last couple of years, it's not surprising. But as this comment says, there's rather what else we need to think about. And I'll read this out loud. More and more, we're seeing reports on plastics, plastic detox on Netflix, for example, that demonstrate the risks to human health from plastics. And obviously both plastic bottles and potentially PET cans, aluminium cans, have plastic involved with them. And we're seeing bisphenol and the kind of forever plastics becoming an issue of considerable concern. How again, then certainly the evidence we're seeing from the work we're doing on other packaging types is there is a concern amongst many consumers about the plastics issue, and that these sort of public domain conversations are feeding into that. Be interested in your views as to whether that really will push back towards people maintaining glass, because we know that glass is safe. We know that you can leave wine in a glass bottle for as long as you like, and nothing's going to happen to it. So, I mean, Marcel, come to you first. I mean, we had a quick discussion about this the other day in terms of how your cans align. Is that an issue in terms of the cans? Then Simon, come to you about how that is resonating, particularly with your rPET bottles.
So yeah, from the can side, there's not an issue at all. We are, legislation is pushing, especially looking European legislation here, and it's a shame the UK is so far behind on that. So bisphenol, there's a legislation ban is bisphenol from July this year. PFAS is coming August. We were ready a long time ago, so we are pulling the trigger on completely BPA and PFAS compliant across EMEA anyway. So for us, UK in and out, we are looking at European level anyway, because we may sometimes need to ship some cans from in or out, so we don't want to be caught in off guard. I cannot speak on behalf of my competitors here, but this is the direction of travel because of European compliance. Just in terms of presence, it's not just for being technical, it's not a liner added into the can. It's like a spray that, protects it, but it's there for a reason. You don't want the liquid in contact with the metal, and you don't want the metal in contact with the liquid. So you have that protection layer, but don't be mistaken. Glass also have, you're gonna have to close that glass somehow. Gonna have some closure that might be plastic or have some plastic in there. So it's not because you have a glass alternative that you're not necessarily going to be having to make those decisions or ensure that the suppliers are fulfilling those targets as well, because our OPP might have a plastic or rubber seal on that anyway.
Thanks for that. It's just I will say in the absence of any of our cork making members, of course, cork finds itself in this whole situation a rather invidious position, in that both in its production, it's sustainable, and in terms of what Marcel's just said about its ability to close wine safely, by comparison potentially with other closure types, because the chain of custody, the onward chain of custody, is not there. Under the UK anyway, it gets listed as a red product, which is ironic given it's probably about as green as it possibly comes. But just one of those interesting idiosyncrasies of how these systems can work out. Simon, come to you next. How have you? I mean, you've mentioned the challenge you've had with bagging in box. Have you seen that pushback to some extent in relation to the RPET bottles you used?
To an extent, I would say. I think that sort of plastics have a number of challenges. It's not just one challenge, and at times you get little spikes of interest from customers, depending on what's sort of been in the news recently. So, for example, one issue with plastics was obviously plastics entering our seas. Now, two of our alpaca bottles that we take are prevented ocean plastic, so we actually hopefully are providing some sort of if not a solution, at least a sort of a remedy to part of that challenge. We do get some questions, some concerns about plastics, but as Marcel has said, there are plastics potentially in the liner for screw caps. There are plastics in some of the binding materials in technical corks. I think once we sort of start having that conversation with customers and start explaining what we're offering, why we're doing it, and where else they might come across plastics, they may not end up agreeing with us, but at least hopefully they understand the rationale behind what we're doing. Just going back to the original question, obviously carbon was the main driver when we started looking at other formats, but when we worked with a sustainability consultancy who conducted a landscape review for us. Carbon reduction was one factor, but we also looked at circularity, genuine recyclability in the UK, and a number of other factors to come up with our choices for that. So whilst carbon was the driver, we didn't just go for the option which was potentially the lowest carbon. We wanted a solution which actually would work within the kind of the boundaries of what we have got in the UK. And it was the bag-in-box and the recycled PET bottle that actually came out as two of the stronger choices in the UK at the moment.
Okay,
so yeah, but yeah, plastics I think does have obviously a challenge to overcome. We shared all the information we can with our members on our website, and we talk about the fact that sustainability often isn't obvious or easy. And there's often payoffs that need to be made.
Thanks, Simon. I mean, Laurel's got a hand up, but I guess whatever you want to say, then I'll also write that with a question, which is, I think following on from what Simon said, a lot of the regulation at the moment has had a kind of carbon driver behind it. But what's your view on the extent to which other sustainability factors fit in? So whatever your response to the other two, and that would be great.
Right. So I think what's an important disclaimer to have, no matter what we're talking about, is at the end of the day, we are talking about a food product. And so the UK, the EU, and every single market that anyone is exporting to are going to have food safety laws. I think there is probably further discussion about BPAs in particular. That is kind of the buzzword, and that's a common substance that consumers are aware of. However, every single country has food contact materials. So even if there is plastics, there's going to be chemical requirements and limits that cannot be used. Even glass, to a certain extent, has a certain chemical structural breakdown that is permitted in substance levels. So that if you do have plastic, you do have aluminum, those are going to be there. PFAS, any of those other kinds, the persistent organic pollutants, those are all going to have limits. The tin and the aluminum have their own things. Even the cork, the ink that's used on the labels, the paper that's used for the labels, the adhesive that's used to adhere the labels to the bottle. All of that is going to have food contact materials. And so while there's always a need to push to make sure things are healthy, not only for the environment, but for the consumer's sustainability, we should always be assuming that these countries are regulating that. And if it's making it to shelf at the time, it is hitting the food safety standards that have been determined by that particular market. So I think that kind of speaks to both what Marcel and Simon are saying when it comes to, say, the bladders that go into bag-in-a-box. That plastic has been regulated to assume that it is safe for human consumption. The same with the aluminum that you'll see in a lot of Ball Corporation's cans.
Yeah, I think that's a point well made. I think one of the things also I think that certainly we have to think about is the point at which there's materiality, relevance. I mean, whilst the life cycle assessment approach is incredibly valuable, one could argue that sometimes it goes into the point of raising issues which are so far away from things that we can change that it's difficult to know how to deal with information. You look at, say, take aluminium. You could arguably say, well, originally, there's aluminium comes from bauxite mining. Bauxite mining has all sorts of challenges around it, which because it's a mining activity. So to what extent do you need to include in a consideration of a packaging type, perhaps the fuel consumption of the digger that took the bauxite out, or do you get to a point where that is so relatively tangential, or that as a packaging maker you can do so little about, or certainly rather as a chooser of a packaging type you can do so little about that it becomes a kind of a pointless thing. On the other hand, recycling rates, so the end of life, is a completely different thing because that really sits within the remit of you retailers to encourage behaviours of regulators and therefore governments to put in place those sorts of things that packaging recycling systems. That there's something that can be done about it. I mean, just a very quick run round as to thoughts on that. Laurel, start with you on this occasion.
Yeah, I do. I would agree with you. I think those are two separate categories. I think we have concern for human consumption, which falls into one remit, and then you have the longevity. And I think that's what a lot of these EPR laws are really trying to address at this point is it is a consumer interest. It's not something that's just fleeting. It's not something that is considered perhaps maybe edgy or you're sort of a population that just likes to do that. Everyone, I think, is concerned with the planet, with maintaining and protecting it. And so those adjustments are happening here. And I think for consumers, the concern is more for end of life of the product, necessarily more than for impact on the body. Again, I think there is a somewhat, at least a notion for most consumers who have some kind of informedness of the foods they're eating, that there are going to be those safety things put in place to protect you from that end. But we really haven't done as much collectively as an industry for other products as well. This goes to water bottles. This goes to, orange juice containers on how that's having end of life. I think consumers now are more interested in once they throw away their product, what happens to it.
Thanks, Laurel. Simon?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there are certain very visible elements around the whole sort of sustainability argument that consumers are particularly concerned with. And I think it is, end of life recycling is the most obvious one for them. In terms of what goes into their bodies, I mean, fundamentally, we are consuming and talking about alcohol here. And I think in many cases, that's what's probably going to finish people off before any element of the packaging does. So I think for our customers in particular, it's the expectation that we as the retailer and the importer stroke producer are doing as much as we can to take the thinking out of their hands, make things as easy as possible for them to feel like they're making the right choices and doing the right thing with the product after they've consumed it.
Marcel?
Peter, touching on the point you mentioned about the box, I think is absolutely relevant. It needs to be looking into that. Like, so for example, from when we look into life cycle, this is part of the life cycle that we cannot hide from that. We cannot run away from that. And so it needs to be, is where the majority of the impact comes from. The beauty of that is that once you recycle the can, you reduce the carbon footprint by 95%. And that's why we are so favoring of the positive return system, because when well designed, we can get 90% plus recycling rates, which we can have more recycled content in our cans. In EMEA, we already have 76% recycled content on average in our cans. The aluminum bottles we can do up to 100% because we control this. We produce our own material for that. So it can go all the way to 100%. So obviously we want systems that will generate more quality, better quantity products. But is that process of kind of being able to reduce the carbon footprint, energy consumption when we're recycling that, it's the kind of the circular economy in action that will help the story for us to have a product that is compatible and comparable with other alternatives.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. One last brief question, because we've only got 3 minutes left to run. Last question in the chat, which is sort of the incumbent versus the upstarts, perhaps. If the glass industry successfully develops scalable electric furnaces powered by low carbon electricity, wouldn't that significantly solve glass packaging sustainability problem and shift the market back away from alternatives like bag and box or cans? As I say, we've got 2 minutes, so a couple of sentences each on that. And I'll go in the same order I did before. Laurel, start with you.
So Marcel and Simon are really the experts on this, so I'm just going to leave with a comment of, regardless whether that does or does not happen, at the end of the day, I think consumer understanding of that is always going to play a big factor. And you'll, at the end of the day, have to look if consumers understand what that means, or if they're always going to assume that can might be better, or if they're always going to prefer bottles because they're used to a certain mentality of consuming that product. So consumers will still come to play at some point.
Okay. Thanks, Laurel. Simon?
So I think it's a really interesting opportunity. It opens up loads of really exciting opportunities that I can kind of see in the UK. I mean, for me, a really nice, elegant solution would be bringing in more of our wine in bulk to the UK in varying sizes of bulk, and then having a kind of circular reuse glass bottle system based around lower carbon glass bottles within the UK would be absolutely fantastic. It would need an awful lot of logistical work, an awful lot of challenges around standardization of bottles within the wine industry, which is not something that you see that much at the moment. But I think there's a massive opportunity there for kind of wine within the UK along those lines. The flip side, I think the other element which is interesting around glass is that we use bottle weight as a little bit of a proxy for the carbon intensity of it. And we do have a massive piece of work within the industry to do to switch from the bottle weight to the carbon intensity of glass, which gives me a bit of a headache with my kind of information gathering hat on. But I think that's something that's going to be necessary down the line.
And Marcel, lastly to you.
For me, can you remind the question? Sorry, what was you left me for the last repeat? Was on the electric furnace. Yeah. So for me, I think that it will solve a lot of the carbon from the production side, but you still have a lot of embedded carbon in transport. Let's not forget that. If you keep on the 400 grams, there's still a lot of transport weight that you're gonna have to work, breakage. So it's great that the industry is moving towards that, and progress is, but it will not. I don't believe it will solve the problem. We talk 75% reduction here, moving to cans. So I think it needs to be better than
that. Great stuff. Well, I think that's a really interesting place to end. And I think actually Simon's point is perhaps the thing that it's often the temptation to see these things as being a challenge or a problem, whereas actually what, as Simon said, we've got here is potentially massive opportunity. That it may not ever replace the bottle, but it means that you've got the convenience of something that you're on a railway train that you can pick that up. Bag in box. I remember, Simon, when you were originally putting your white burgundy in a bag in box, the argument was it's convenient. It can sit in the milk shelf of the fridge. So I think this is the thing that, there's often some negativity in wine at the moment, but I think actually this packaging discussion has the opportunity to be really exciting and allows wine to get into to paraphrase the advertising campaign for a different beverage, to reach parts that other wine cannot reach. And but also, as we've just seen in those last questions about glass, that this is obliging the glass industry also to think about things in a slightly different way, which I think is all to the good. And again, I think I'd come back to Simon's last point that, like him, we've certainly seen bottled weight as being a proxy for carbon intensity. But, as we approach our next phase of the bottle weight accord, it's clear that we're going to have to look much more at intensity rather than bottle weight per se, because obviously increasingly the intensity of carbon per bottle is very different in different parts of the world. So I think all of this is incredibly fascinating. I'd really like to thank Simon, Marcel, and Laurel for some really fascinating contributions. Really, really pleased to have you here. And everyone in the audience, I hope you've had a great time, found it interesting. Everyone seems to have stayed along to the end, which is always a good sign. Especially when I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but on a nice hot sunny day when a glass stroke bottle stroke can stroke format of your choice of vino would probably be a good idea. So again, thanks for coming. If there are any questions from anyone in the audience, by all means, email one of us at SWR. We'd be very happy to help. But again, thanks very much indeed to the panelists, and all of the rest of you have a very lovely day. Goodbye.